Welcome to today's Seidokan Saturday. So, last week I introduced the concept of static stretching. Today we're going to talk about dynamic stretching, and then the third type next Saturday will be on proprioceptive neurological facilitation. Whole big mouthful, PNF for short. Now, there are combinations of all three of these, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that right away. But to understand last week's static stretching, you need to understand in all three of these, there's a difference in how the muscles are used. So when we're talking about muscle movement or muscle contractions, we have an agonist, which is the mover, the muscle that actually shortens to move a joint. So if I bend my arm this way, my biceps gets shorter and the elbow flexes. If I contract my triceps, then the triceps muscle gets shorter and the elbow extends. So we have flexion and extension, we have a moving muscle, and we have a non-moving muscle. If I'm flexing the elbow, the biceps shortening is the agonist. On the opposite side of the bone is the triceps, which is the antagonist, or the muscle that works against. So figure if my triceps were just really tight, like I'd done 150, 300 push-ups or something, and my triceps are just burning. If I go to curl my biceps, my triceps being so tight will actually add resistance to the biceps curl. So we have the agonist, in this case the biceps, and the antagonist. In the opposite direction, if I'm extending my elbow, then the triceps are contracting, that's the agonist causing the movement, and the antagonist would be my biceps. So in the same way, if I had just done 100 curls, and then I went to do a triceps extension, I would have the added resistance from the tight biceps muscle working against it as an antagonist. So agonist, antagonist. Now to go back to last week's static stretching. In static stretching, neither the agonist or antagonist, the working or the opposing muscle, neither one are doing any work. If I'm doing static stretching, sitting on the floor for example, okay, which is typically the one that we do before class. We sit down, we go through our stretches, and I'm reaching forward. As I'm reaching forward, my quadriceps, my thigh, and my hamstrings both are passive. I'm not contracting either muscle, I'm not moving a joint, but what I am doing is moving a different body part, in this case my upper body, against the muscle that I'm stretching, which would be in this case the hamstrings. So neither the agonist, the working muscle, nor the antagonist, the opposing muscle, are doing anything in this situation. I'm using a completely different body part to push against the muscle that I want to stretch. Same way if I'm doing a static stretch for my quadriceps. If I'm stretching my thigh and I grab my foot here, I'm not contracting my hamstrings. I'm using my hand, in this case, to apply the stretch to stretch my thigh. So neither the working muscle nor, in this case the working muscle, nor the stretched muscle, neither one are doing anything. They're just passively along for the ride while I use a different body part to create the stretch. If I'm stretching my shoulder, for example, here, my pecs are what cause the arm to come forward typically in my anterior deltoid and pectoralis major minor. All of that is what causes my arm to come in. But they're not doing any work here. I'm using the opposite arm to pull to cause the stretch. If I put my hands behind to stretch the front of my shoulder, I'm not using my posterior deltoid or back, I'm using the opposite hand to pull back against. So I'm using a separate body part while the working and non-working muscles simply relax through the motion. That's static stretching. Now in dynamic stretching, we use an agonist motion to stretch the antagonist. Bear with me. So if I'm going to stretch my quadriceps, instead of using my hand here to pull statically, I would actively use my glutes and hamstring, for example, in a butt kicker in order to stretch my quadriceps. So I'd be actively contracting my hamstrings, my biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. I would actively contract those muscles and my glutes to posteriorly extend at the hip which stretches my quadriceps. This becomes a dynamic stretch. If I want to stretch my hamstrings instead of my quads, instead of sitting on the floor, or I could do it sitting, I'll show that in a second, but I would lift. And in this case, I'm using my hip flexor and quadriceps to pull the antagonist, which is my hamstring complex. So I'm using my agonist muscles to stretch my antagonist muscles. Okay? If I'm stretching my triceps, I flex my biceps and go back overhead. Going back to the shoulder, I use my pectoralis and anterior deltoids to pull across to the front, stretching my back. I use my rhomboids, my posterior delts, to stretch my pecs. And so we have dynamic motion. Okay? So if I'm using my agonist muscle to stretch the antagonist muscle, that is dynamic stretching. These are the swinging or lifting motions. If I wanted to stretch my inner thigh, I would lift with the outer thigh. Okay, I'd use my adductors to stretch my abductors. So a passive or static stretch, none of the muscles that you're stretching or related agonist-antagonist pair do anything. A separate body part passively moves that muscle. In dynamic stretching, which is much more effective, I use the contracting muscle to stretch the antagonist muscle. That's the difference between static and dynamic. And in dynamic stretching, because I'm using movement and I'm using contracting the muscle to pull the opposing muscle, it becomes much more effective as a warm-up. So as static stretching is primarily useful as a cool down and to increase flexibility post-workout, dynamic stretching is simply to recruit the already available range of motion. I'm not going to get more flexible typically with most dynamic stretching unless we do a whole lot of it, and then it becomes a workout instead of a warm-up. That changes the thing. But the dynamic stretch, I'm using one muscle to stretch the opposing muscle group. Now, I'm going to add to this just a couple of little things, and I hope it doesn't go too long. There's a feedback loop, and there's which I'll talk about, and then ballistic stretching, which is an extreme form of dynamic stretching. For years, we were cautioned against ballistic stretching, which is specifically, in this case, just swinging the leg up as high as we can, as hard as we can. Oh, that's going to damage you. It's going to pull and tear a muscle. But imagine if a baseball pitcher or a football punter on an American football team didn't stretch that way before they went out to throw the ball or kick the ball. They would be totally unprepared for that movement. So at a certain point, doing these high swinging, hard swinging kicks is useful if we have enough blood flow and proper warm-up beforehand, which I talked about in the warm-up concept. The way to kind of get around that is we short-circuit the feedback loop. So we have sensors in our muscles called muscle spindles that say, hey, you're stretching too fast. And the muscle spindle response is to tighten that muscle up so that it won't stretch too fast. Well, the problem is if I'm swinging that leg hard with some momentum, the muscle spindle engaging merely tightens the muscle, and if it's overpowered by the agonist, in this case my quads, if my quads are pulling really hard and contracting fast, it can overpower that muscle spindle that tightens, and that's where we get a pulled muscle. There's the danger of ballistic stretching. There's a way to short circuit that. In the same way that you can't tickle yourself, your body senses proprioceptively, that's your body's awareness of itself in space, your body senses where it is. So if I put my hand up, my brain says, hey, muscle spindle of the hamstring, you don't need to do anything because the hand will stop the motion. And so if in swinging my leg to here, I feel a pull, if I put my hand here, now I can swing much more easily, even higher, and I don't feel any pull because I've created a feedback loop to my own body that says, my hand will stop the motion, you don't have to tighten up to do that, okay? So we have that way of being able to do a ballistic stretch, but safely, so that we can repeatedly swing our legs without feeling that pull in my hamstring or my groin here in this case. So if I wanted to really swing my leg up high sideways, that might pull in both of my groin muscles. But if I give my hand out here as a feedback loop, then there's no strain or stretch because that muscle spindle didn't tighten up my groin muscles, leading to a potential pull. Now, if I'm fully warmed up, let's say I've done that just passive or the feedback loop dynamic stretch a few times, and now I have some blood flow in the muscle, then we can go ahead and swing with a little more oomph, a little more power, and ballistically, because we're more warmed up and there's blood flow and everything is lubricated and working, okay? So for warm-up purposes, dynamic stretching is ideal. It puts your body through its own natural range of motion by using an agonist muscle to stretch the antagonist, or an agonist muscle to stretch the antagonist. That is dynamic stretching. It can be done fast, starting with a feedback loop, then releasing the feedback and going ballistic stretching, going ballistic, beautiful. Or we can simply stick to good dynamic stretching. Now there's also passive dynamic stretching where I'm not really swinging the limb, but let's say I'm just lifting it and then lift. This, again, I'm using the agonist adductor complex to stretch the adductors in this case, but I'm doing neither swinging nor a feedback loop because the range of motion is so small in contracting my agonist or working muscle that I'm not in danger of getting momentum that would overpower and pull. So there are lighter ways. I can just do this and this rather than the full swing, and in doing so still get my range of motion without the risk of momentum creating a muscle pull. That's a lot, I know. Read through it, study through it a little bit, look at how you do your warm-ups in class. But dynamic stretching is ideal for the warm-up phase of a class. Athletes typically will go through, we had several things we do with our athletes at Dixie College, Dixie University, and at Utah Valley University and other colleges and athletes that I've worked with, where we put our feet in different positions. For example, do a quarter squat, then a full squat. Now we go wider, feet parallel, quarter squat, full squat. Then we go close together, quarter squat, full squat. Then we do the same three positions, but with the feet slightly turned in, feet offset, forward and back, feet slightly turned out. And by doing so, we work all of the lower body range of motion in a dynamic, short, long, wider, same thing, close in, same thing, keeping heels down, offset, same thing. So there are a variety of positions, same thing with push-ups, hands, all sorts of things. Loads of ways to go through moving range of motion as a warm-up to establish your existing flexibility. That's the purpose of dynamic warm-up. Not to get more flexible, but to access your existing maximal range of motion, which is what the warm-up should be about. Next week, more science, proprioceptive neurological facilitation, and sort of a summary of it all. As a preview, proprioceptive neurological facilitation. So we have static, dynamic, PNF. Static, no working or opposing muscle groups do anything. A separate body part puts you through the range of motion. Dynamic, the working muscle stretches the opposing muscle group. Next week, proprioceptive neurological facilitation. Both the working and opposing, both the agonist and antagonist muscles are involved. Stay tuned until next week. Thank you for joining and keep training.